The last few Sundays, we have been going through the Gospel of Mark and talking about what message this Gospel has. It's always important to get insight into the life of Jesus and to look at the things He has done, the things that He's taught, and the example that He has set. This morning, we are beginning in Mark chapter 7 in verse 24. And we'll go through chapter 8 and verse 26. We'll look at just kind of some of the more, I guess you might almost say some of the more unusual miracle stories that exist in this gospel. And we'll just kind of go through them and try to talk about what is the common thread that ties all of these different things together. Last time we talked about Jesus' teaching on the subjects of tradition and defilement. In chapter 7 and verses 1 through 23, Jesus made the point, first of all, that the traditions of men can never be an adequate substitute for the commandments of God. And He also talked quite a bit about defilement and said something that's rather counterintuitive to the way I think a lot of Christians today might even think about defilement. Jesus made the point that it is not what is outside of the body that can defile you. It's not what goes into the body from the outside, whether it be eating unclean foods, or whether it be contact with a corpse, or whether it be violations of any of these other Jewish ritual laws. Rather, it's what comes out of the man that defiles him, what comes out of his heart. The evil thoughts, the murders, the adulteries, the deeds of coveting, the things that are expressions of who a person actually is on the inside. Those are the things that defile and truly contaminate. And perhaps, and I started looking more at this, I wondered if I had stopped too short in the text. Because what follows is a story that runs very counter to the Jewish ideas of defilement. If we pick up in chapter 7 and verse 24, Jesus got up and went away from there to the region of Tyre. And when He had entered a house, He wanted no one to know of it, yet He could not escape notice. But after hearing of Him, a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately came and fell at His feet. Now the woman was a Gentile of the Syrophoenician race, and she kept asking Him to cast the demon out of her daughter. And He was saying to her, "Let the children be satisfied first, for it is not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." But she answered and said to Him, "Yes, Lord, but even the dogs under the table feed on the children's crumbs." And He said to her, "Because of this answer, go. The demon has gone out of your daughter." And going back to her home, she found the child lying on the bed, the demon having left. Excuse me. So right on the heels of Jesus' teaching on defilement, where Jesus had made the implication that all foods are now clean in verse 19, He goes to the Gentiles, and you kind of wonder, almost implicit, is He now implying that all peoples are now clean by spending time among the Gentiles? In fact, this point later gets made in the book of Acts, chapter 10, where Peter has that vision of the different kinds of animals coming down out of heaven, and the voice says, "Arise, Peter, kill and eat." And Peter protests, "No, I haven't eaten anything unclean since my youth." And the Lord tells him, "What the Lord has cleansed, let no one call unholy." Jesus, however, He goes now into Gentile territory long before that happens to Peter. And this time He's gone as far as Tyre, a Phoenician city outside of where the Jews normally lived. His motive for doing this is, He's seeking isolation. He wants no one to know of it. It's a common thing in the Gospel of Mark. Jesus trying to get away from people. And this is actually, I think this is Jesus' only true recorded excursion beyond the borders of what we would know as ancient Israel. But even though Jesus has gone to Tyre to escape notice, somehow He fails to escape notice again. And what happens, of course, is that somebody does find Him. In fact, people from Tyre and Sidon had come to see Him in the past. It's mentioned in chapter 3 and verse 8 that some folks from Tyre and Sidon had come to hear. So His reputation has actually reached this area beforehand. But in particular now, we have this one woman who is a demon-possessed daughter who falls at His feet. This isn't the first time Jesus has cast out demons in a Gentile-ish territory. We saw that in chapter 5. This woman's a Gentile. The text is very explicit about this. She's a Syro-Phoenician, which, that area, Syria, Phoenicia, Tyre, Sidon, it's all kind of right next to each other. She's a Syro-Phoenician. She's very explicitly not a Jew. And, Jews and Gentiles didn't really have that much to do with each other. I mean, the Gentiles didn't observe the ritual purity laws. They thought it was perfectly fine to eat bacon. And the Jews did not. This created this obvious dividing wall, because nothing divides people like the argument of whether or not you should eat bacon. And this creates this dividing wall between the two communities. And also they didn't like each other very much. The Jews thought the Gentiles were unholy pagans, and the Gentiles thought the Jews were these weird, isolated, cults of people that didn't really have anything to do with each other. And right away we have to do with them, rather. Right away, we have this strange cultural situation where this Gentile woman comes to Jesus, a Jew, and asks him to save her daughter. Cast a demon out of her daughter. And what makes this miracle story so strange is the ensuing conversation. I've always read this and thought, this is really weird how Jesus handles this woman. He says, let the children be satisfied first. It's not good to take children's bread and throw it to dogs. Oh, but even the dogs feed on the crumbs under the table. Well, because of this answer, go. The demon has left your daughter. And the woman gets home. She finds out, her daughter doesn't have a demon anymore. What's going on here? Did Jesus just intentionally put her off? Also, children, dogs, it's obvious from a careful reading of this that by children he means Jews and by dogs he means Gentiles, which is kind of insulting, actually. You just call her a dog? Is Jesus racist against Gentiles? Is that what's really going on here? Well, let's consider a couple of things. First of all, you definitely need to be reading the story in light of the talk that preceded it about defilement. And Jesus' main teaching about defilement is that nothing outside the man really defiles him. And it must, by definition, must be extended to Jew-Gentile relations. It's secondly important to note that the people Jesus was arguing in chapter 7, the people he was so rebuking were the Pharisees. And the Pharisees and Jesus' disciples are unable to comprehend the gist of a message that contrasts starkly, and this contrasts starkly with the faith of a Gentile woman. Herein we have this problem where, on the one hand, Jesus is interacting with the Jewish people who should have known better, who should have known the law of Moses, who should have understood the teaching, who were the most readily equipped, one would think, to understand the message of the kingdom. And Jesus has to pound it into their heads. This is what he came for. But on the other hand, he encounters this Gentile woman who's like, I'm not here for you. I'm not here for you. And she still persists. She gets it even when he's trying to talk her out of it. And now you start to understand the issue here. On the one hand, Jesus presents his message so plainly to people who should have known better, and they don't have faith. But on the other hand, even when he tries to keep himself away from this woman, she cannot be deprived of him. She will not stay away from him. Can it be that a pagan outsider understands more about the message of the gospel than the Jews who saw themselves as Paul put it, a guide to the blind, a light to those who are in darkness? Is there ever a situation where outsiders get the teaching of Jesus better than, insiders do? There's an instance here with this woman. It's similar to another story not found in Mark, where Jesus heals the servant of a centurion. The centurion doesn't even think he's worthy enough for Jesus to come under his roof. He says, look, just say the word and my servant will be healed. That's a statement of faith right there. A statement of faith that Jesus said he had not found anywhere in Israel. When a woman who was bleeding for 12 years thought, well, if I just touch the fringe of his garment, I will be healed. Jesus said that her faith had saved her. And when this woman says, yes, Jesus, I know, you're not going to take the children's bread and give it to dogs, but can I at least get the crumbs? Certainly the crumbs are enough from you, right? It's more of that same idea. Because of this answer, go. Your daughter is healed. Herein we have an instance where someone's faith is greater. A faith of a Gentile is greater than the kinds of things that Jesus finds in Israel. And so that's the first unusual miracle story. But it raises this question. This woman sees. What about the people in Israel? Are they blind? Let's keep reading. In verse 31, again he went out from the region of Tyre and came through Sidon to the Sea of Galilee, within the region of Decapolis. They brought to him one who was deaf and spoke with difficulty, and they implored him to lay his hand on him. Jesus took him aside from the crowd by himself and put his fingers into his ears, and after spitting, he touched his tongue with the saliva, and looking up to heaven with a deep sigh, he said to him, "Ephphatha," that is, "be opened." And his ears were opened, and the impediment of his tongue was removed, and he began speaking plainly. And he gave them orders not to tell anyone. But the more he ordered them, the more widely they continued to proclaim it. They were utterly astonished, saying, "He has done all things well. He makes even the deaf to hear and the mute to speak." This time Jesus leaves Tyre Sidon for Decapolis. He finds a man who is deaf and has trouble speaking, and they want Jesus to lay his hands on this man and heal him. And Jesus does something that's kind of weird. You don't see him do very often. He gives this guy a wet willy, basically. He looks up to heaven and groans. The word there for groaning or sighing in verse 34, stenazo, it almost implies like Jesus is annoyed about having to perform a miracle. That's very strange, but it's a term that keeps coming back in Mark. Like, how many more times am I going to have to put up with you people? How many more times am I going to have to prove myself to you people before you get it? He says ephphatha, which is Aramaic for be open. The man has his ears open. His tongue is loosened. Now he can speak plainly. And even though he can speak, Jesus says, don't tell anyone about this. Which is pretty consistent with Jesus, actually. He's constantly trying to get people to keep things secret throughout the Gospel of Mark. We've seen this over and over and over in the stories. And just as before, we've seen this over and over and over too. How many times do people pay attention to Jesus' instructions not to tell anyone? Never. They tell everybody. So once again, people ignore these orders. And no matter how much Jesus tells people, don't go blabbing about the miracle, the news continues to be widely proclaimed everywhere. He does all things well. People are excited about Jesus. He makes the deaf to hear. He makes the mute to speak. This isn't the last time we're going to see Jesus use his spit to perform a miracle either, by the way. We're going to keep going. A third miracle story. And again, what makes this one, in chapter 8, in verses 1 through 10, we have a miracle story that's unusual because it looks so familiar to us. In those days, when there was again a large crowd and they had nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples and said to them, "I feel compassion for the people because they have remained with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them away hungry to their homes, they will faint on the way, and some of them will have come from a great distance." His disciples answered him, "Where will anyone be able to find enough bread here in this desolate place to satisfy these people?" And he was asking them, "How many loaves do you have?" They said, 7. He directed the people to sit down on the ground, and taking the 7 loaves, he gave thanks and broke them and started giving them to his disciples to serve to them. And they served them to the people. They also had a few small fish, and after he had blessed them, he ordered them these to be served as well. They ate, were satisfied. They picked up 7 large baskets full of what was left over of the broken pieces. About 4,000 men were there. About 4,000 were there. He sent them away, and immediately he entered the boat with his disciples and came into the district of Dalmanutha. Now that story looks kind of familiar, because we saw it in chapter 6, when Jesus fed 5,000 people. And the similarities abound here. They both take place in a wilderness place. They both have a statement about Jesus feeling compassion for the people. Jesus doesn't want to send them away. He wants to feed them there on the spot. The disciples wonder, where are the resources to deal with this? In chapter 6 it was, how are we going to pay for it? In chapter 8 it's where we're going to find it. Jesus asks how many loaves. An answer is given. In chapter 6 it was 5. Here it's 7. The people are told to sit down. Jesus gives thanks. He breaks the bread. The disciples distribute the food. And also there were fish. There were leftover baskets of more than what they started with, whether it was 12 in chapter 6 or whether it was 7 here. 5,000 men were fed in chapter 6. 4,000 are fed here in chapter 8. And then both stories conclude with people getting into a boat afterwards. So there's actually very little in this story that's genuinely different from what we read before. I mean, details and incidentals mostly. 7 loaves instead of 5 loaves. 7 baskets instead of 12 baskets. 4,000 people instead of 5,000 people. They sit on the ground instead of the green grass. But it's the same story. And that's the bit that I think we need to pay attention to. Why are we told this? if we're just cherry-picking stories out of the gospel and reading them at random, Jesus fed 4,000 people. He's so good at food and being generous and, demonstrating power and all that. Well, you might miss the point of the story if you have not also read prior the 5,000, feeding of the 5,000. Because the first time Jesus does it, it's a surprise to the disciples. They don't see it coming. Oh, Jesus can feed all these people. We didn't realize He could do that. So, if chapter 6 has already happened and the disciples were there for that, why is it we get to chapter 8 and the disciples are the ones who are asking, where are we going to get the bread? Wait a second, what? Jesus did it once. He proved He could do this. Well, can He really do it twice? Maybe that was a one-time special thing. You want to talk about the hardness of hearts and the problems that people have. This is effectively what Israel was doing in the wilderness. Psalm 78 says that they spoke against God. They said, can God prepare a table in the wilderness? Behold, He struck the rocks so that waters gushed out and streams were overflowing. Can He give bread also? Will He provide meat for His people? Well, yeah, I know He provided for us before, but can He do it again? What kind of talk is that? Do you think that God's powers are like one use only or something? Is that how that works? Is God's multiplication of bread like a technique that's just disposable? Well, I did it once, I'm out. Sorry guys, come back next week. That's not how God works. That's not how Jesus works. What do you mean? Where are we going to get the loaves? We're in a desolate place. This is a wilderness. What, God can't feed people in the wilderness? That's the whole point that Jesus has been trying to get across to them since the beginning. It's one thing for a crowd of 4,000. They have more bread to start with and less people to feed. So why are they asking, where are we going to get the stuff? It's one thing if you're in the crowd of 4,000 that hasn't, maybe they haven't seen it before. But, are the disciples still blind? And what about us? This isn't a problem for the disciples only. This is a problem for us too. What about us who see the power of God demonstrated in His Word, who have borne witness to it in our lives, who have the Scriptures before us? Are we most exposed to God's truths, also most blind to it? Take it most for granted? Don't tell me it can't happen. You think of Israel in the wilderness, they're sitting in front of Mount Sinai. The glory of the Lord is right there. It's pretty visible. But 40 days later, why don't we build a golden calf? We don't know what's going on up there. Are you crazy? After 40 days? Can you get complacent about the visible glory of God after 40 days? How we forget. How quickly humans forget. And how necessary our diligence is in making sure we do not forget what the Lord has done. And I'm not off base in reading the story this way, because you've got to keep reading to see the clues. In verses 11 through 13, the Pharisees came out and began to argue with Him, seeking from Him a sign from heaven to test Him. Sighing deeply in his spirit, he said, why does this generation seek for a sign? Truly I say to you, no sign will be given to this generation. Leaving them, he again embarked and went on away to the other side. How many times are you going to cross that lake? The Pharisees started an argument with Jesus, which is their usual thing that they like to do. And since they weren't successful at criticizing His rejection of their traditions, hey, we're going to put the burden of proof on you, Jesus. Show us a sign. You know what the problem with that request is? Show us a sign. You're not supposed to ask for signs from God. The Bible doesn't really say that. In fact, there are times when some people are rebuked for not asking for signs, like in Isaiah chapter 7 with Ahaz. But the problem isn't that. The problem is Jesus has done plenty of signs. That's what's really the problem. Jesus has done lots of signs. So what are you doing here asking for a sign? It's absurd to ask for a sign to prove Jesus' authority, considering He's already done so many of them, and they're all public knowledge. He's been commanding unclean spirits and they obey Him. Is that not a sign of His authority? He's been commanding the wind and the waves and it obeys Him. He's been feeding the masses. He's been healing the sick. What more signs do you need? Well, in fact, almost Jesus' arguments with the Pharisees in the Gospel are almost always precipitated by some kind of miracle. Like in chapter 2, when they're going, who can forgive sins but God alone? And He responds by showing them that He has the authority to forgive sins by telling a paralytic man to get up and walk. Or in chapter 3, when they're in the synagogue, and they're all trying to trick, maybe we can catch him healing on the Sabbath. And he heals on the Sabbath. You see the problem here? They're expecting him to heal on the Sabbath. They think he can do it. They know he's going to perform the sign. They just want to use it as an excuse to accuse him. And now you come along and ask for a sign. All those signs aren't good enough? We want to see a sign from you. Jesus groans again. You can just feel the exasperation. Why are you asking for signs? No sign will be given to this generation. Turns out Jesus doesn't perform on command. Now, of course, you and I know that lots of signs were already given to that generation. And in fact, he does perform more miracles as the gospel progresses. And then later, he gives them a real sign. The cross, the resurrection. Matthew's account adds the phrase, no sign will be given except the sign of Jonah. No, they're going to get a sign. It's just not the sign they want. They want Jesus to perform on command, like one of their circus monkeys or something. That's not how Jesus operates. But this conflict with the Pharisees, we want to see a sign. You see how it mirrors the problem that the disciples have? Witnessing a feeding and not saying, oh, wait, this is the sort of thing that Jesus does. Which leads us to this scene when he's alone with his disciples in verse 14. They had forgotten to take bread. They did not have more than one loaf in the boat with them. Oh, this is going to end. He was giving orders to them saying, watch out! Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. They began to discuss with one another the fact that they had no bread. And Jesus, aware of this, said to them, why do you discuss the fact that you have no bread? Do you not see or understand? Do you have a hardened heart? Having eyes, do you not see? And having ears, do you not hear? And do you not remember? When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces you picked up? They said to him, 12. When I broke the 7 for the 4,000, how many large baskets full of broken pieces did you pick up? And they said to him, 7. He was saying to them, do you not yet understand? Here they are. They get in the boat. They forget to take bread. And Jesus says, watch out for the leaven of the Pharisees, for the leaven of Herod. And so what happens? Well, this is clearly a problem. He must be bringing this up because we don't have any bread. And so they start talking about the fact that they have no bread. And totally miss the point altogether. This is one of those... this is a classic instance where you shouldn't interpret God's words literally because Jesus rebukes them for interpreting Him literally. You notice that? I bet some people, they think, every passage of the Bible should be interpreted literally unless they have some good reason to think otherwise. Yeah, like God meant it not that way. You might as well say, well, every passage should be interpreted literally unless it isn't, which is an absurd rule when you think about it because, duh, of course. Defaulting to literal interpretation just because you have no reason to, well, it's like the disciples said. And I dare say, maybe some of us would have even done the same thing. Oh, no, don't twist Jesus' words. He meant actual bread. He was talking about leaven. He wasn't talking about anything deeper than that. Well, it's pretty obvious if you had said that, you would have been wrong because Jesus did mean something other than that. Matthew's account makes it explicit in Matthew 16 and verse 12 that Jesus was talking about the teaching of the Pharisees. Why are you just... And in fact, he says, you should know this, that we're not concerned about the absence of bread here, because you've seen what I've done. Why discuss the absence of bread? Didn't you see it? Is your heart hardened? Having eyes, do you not see? Having ears, do you not hear? An allusion to Isaiah 6. A text that Jesus alluded to back when he was explaining the reasons why he spoke in parables in chapter 4. It turns out that Jesus' miracles, you see, have been parables in action all along. Yeah, sure, you've got the miracle story, the story on the surface, and you can read that and you can leave it as is. But what you really need to do is you need to figure out what the sign is pointing to, what the sign is directed at. The disciples have their own parable to work out. Do they grasp the meaning? Do they get it? Or are they blind? Look at the miracles. I fed 5,000 with 5 loaves and had 12 baskets left over. I fed 4,000 with 7 loaves and there were 7 baskets left over. Do you think that I am worried about the absence of bread in the boat? After all that, don't you realize that bread is not a problem for Jesus? And ergo, when I warned you, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and of Herod, I wasn't talking about bread. No. Rather, the leaven is a symbol for something else. In this case, the teaching of the Pharisees, the influence of the Pharisees, the behavior of the Pharisees, the hardness of heart of the Pharisees that dares to ask after seeing signs, "Oh, we want to see a sign from you, teacher." The disciples, when you look at the way he talks to them, he says, you're teetering very dangerously on that same idea of asking for a sign. Where are we going to get the bread? It's very close to the same problem. Are you blind too? You who are supposed to be a light to the blind? The Pharisees' behavior has taught that it's okay to demand signs from God after God has given ample evidence. And the disciples seem to think that Jesus is incapable of performing a miracle after He's already performed it twice in front of them. Are the disciples so blind that their case is hopeless? Does blindness have to be the end of their story? Are blind and seeing the only two places a person can be? Well, let's keep reading, actually, because we're not done. Verse 22, they came to Bethsaida. They brought a blind man to Jesus and implored Him to touch him. And taking the blind man by the hand, He brought him out of the village. And after spitting on his eyes and laying His hands on him, He asked him, "Do you see anything?" He looked up and said, "I see men. I see them like trees walking around." He again laid His hands on his eyes. He looked intently and was restored and began to see everything clearly. And He sent him to his home, saying, "Do not even enter the village." Now that healing is not mentioned in any other gospel. It's only mentioned in Mark, which, when you consider there's not many stories that are unique to Mark, that's pretty impressive. They bring a blind man to Jesus. They ask Jesus to touch him. Jesus spits on his eyes, because Jesus likes to spit in these miracle stories, and lays hands on him and asks him if he sees. And the blind man sees, kinda. Men, he sees. He sees them like trees. Well, if men look like trees to you, you're having some pretty blurry vision issues. They're walking around, all that. I see something. And so what does Jesus do? Well, He lays hands on him again. And now the blind man sees clearly. And Jesus, again, tries to keep it quiet by telling him to avoid the village. And this is yet another weird miracle story, isn't it? Because Jesus has to heal the guy twice. And some have cited this as, this is embarrassing. Why didn't Jesus' healing powers work the first time? Now you can think about this, you can interpret this two ways. Either Jesus' miracle healings are very touch and go all of a sudden, and didn't work the first time, let's try again. Or Jesus intended it to take 2 attempts for a reason, for a purpose. And Jesus took 2 attempts to heal this man because He wanted to do it that way. But if He wanted to do it that way, why? Why would Jesus do that? And, well, that's simple. Because Jesus' healings, Jesus' miracles, have never been about the miracles themselves at all. This is a living parable. It is for something bigger. And it's proven by the subsequent stories. The blind man's healing, it's not just about a blind guy getting his sight back. It's a story about the disciples as well. Are they blind? Not completely. The fact that Jesus has touched their lives means they're not completely blind. They get something about who He is. But their vision of Jesus, it's still blurry. They haven't really grasped what He's doing. And it's proven by the subsequent stories. Because the very next thing in the Gospel of Mark that happens is Jesus asks Peter, "Okay, who do people say that I am?" Peter gives a bunch of different answers. "Who do you say that I am?" "You are the Christ." Peter gives the right answer. He sees something. And then the next thing Jesus says, "Okay, now the Christ is going to suffer and die and be raised on the 3rd day." "Whoa, Jesus, whoa." Peter starts rebuking him and arguing with him. And argue with the Christ on what His mission is? So, the disciples see something, but their vision's not clear. Not yet. That's the story that's really being told here. The story of these miracles, these strange stories, and why they seem strange to us, when we start understanding, it's really a story about the disciples. It's really a story about how Jesus is showing them, His truth. It's not revealed completely yet, They see it dimly. They see it blurrily, indirectly. It isn't until Christ completes His work they can see it clearly for what it is. But it's also a story about us. Because I dare say that sometimes, maybe our vision of Jesus has gotten a little blurry. Or maybe it's always been a little blurry. Do we see Jesus for who He is? Is He truly the Lord of our lives? The commander of our destiny, the ultimate authority for everything that we say and everything that we do, so that we are living out the very truth of Colossians 3:17, that whatever you do in word or deed, do all in the name of the Lord Jesus. Do we see Jesus' selfless, sacrificial, suffering behavior on the cross as the pattern for our existence? Or are we content, to do the bare minimum? Or wait for someone else to prove to us, well, Christ wants more of you. Well, prove it. Show me another sign. No, He wants our total devotion. What Jesus expects of us is demonstrated by what He gave to us. Do we eat the leaven of the Pharisees and of Herod, who constantly demand a sign, constantly make excuses, constantly find another reason to not do what God says? Or do we eat the true bread of life, digesting, incorporating Christ into our existence, no longer worrying about where we will get physical bread, but rather trusting in Him to sustain us? Do we see, or are we blind? Or maybe we're not quite there yet. Maybe we see something, but it's blurry. Maybe we get a little bit of the story. We're just clinging on to a piece of it. We haven't fully committed ourselves to the message of the cross. Maybe these miracle stories are just a bunch of facts about a guy that came and did nice things for people, but we haven't really contemplated the deeper message that He is the Lord, the suffering Lord, who submits Himself to the role of servant in order to die for our sins, in order to bring us to God. Take out your songbooks as we conclude this morning. Maybe you only see things dimly right now. Maybe that's your story. Maybe some inkling of the message has gotten through and you realize, well, maybe there's more to it. Maybe you have blurry vision and you want to clear it up. The answers are here in the Scriptures. We have to ask ourselves the question, are you committed to Christ? Have you been joined with Him in His death, burial, and resurrection through baptism? Have you stayed committed to Him? Are you walking on the path of the cross? Have you made a resolution, a commitment to follow the Savior, to enter the kingdom? Because making such a resolution is one way to help you see the completed work. Not blurry, not in a mirror dimly, but as it really is. If you're here this morning and you need to fix that and make your life right, don't be blind. Come to Christ. While together we stand and while we sing.